Before we get into the video, I just wanted to let you know that I'm working on a new course about the basics of Godot. If you want to get notified when the course is released, and if you want to receive special coupons that I'm going to be giving out, make sure to subscribe to my email list. There's a link in the description. Hi everyone! In this video, we're going to be creating a simple platformer character in Godot. This is what we're going to be creating. We have a simple character that can run around and jump. That's it. All the basics you need to get a platformer character going. This is going to be half tutorial and half demonstration. I'm going to be going faster than I usually do in my tutorials. Let me know if you're interested in a more in-depth platformer series. Leave a comment and just let me know. Let's go ahead and get started. I have an empty project here that I imported some assets. And first I'm gonna go to my 2D workspace and look at my asset. So by default, it's very blurry, so I'm gonna delete this first and change my import settings to 2D pixel. And I'm gonna set this as default. Re-import, and now it should be looking good. This asset I found on itch.io, and I've included a link in the description if you want to get it yourself. Let's delete this too. I'm gonna create a world scene. Let's just save it here. I'm gonna go inside my project settings and set a smaller window size, 320 by 180, and my test width is going to be 1280 by 720. I'm also going to set my stretch mode to 2D and my aspect to keep. Okay. Now I'm going to start creating the player. I'm going to add a new kinematic body 2D. Call this player. I'm gonna save this as a scene, create a new folder called characters, one more called player. I'm gonna save it here. And let's go to the player scene. This is gonna have a sprite, a collision shape 2D, and an animation player. Let's give the sprite the asset we imported, and this has in total 19 horizontal frames, and I'm gonna position this. Well, first I'm gonna turn on pixel snap, and I'm gonna position this like this. Let's also add a collision shape. Okay, now I'm gonna add a script. It's gonna be an empty GD script, create. And before I start implementing the player functionality, I'm gonna add a static body to the world scene, just to have, just to have a ground going on. I accidentally turned on the grid. I'm gonna turn off. It's not going off for some reason. Because I have snap on. Okay, cool. Let's add collision shape to the ground, and I'm gonna use the Godot icon to as ground texture. Let's give this a collision shape about that size. Let's resize this icon. It's gonna look funny, but for now it's okay. This is just a prototype. I'm gonna move this to here. I'm also gonna move the player here. Okay, good. Let's just take a look how it looks. Select the main scene, world. Okay. Now I'm gonna start writing some code inside the player script. Let's first define some variables that we're gonna need. I'm gonna have an input vector that I'm gonna use for movement, velocity, acceleration. This is going to be an integer. Let's just say 256. A jump force and the gravity. Let's start by making the player move horizontally. So inside my physics process, I'm gonna check for horizontal movement, but first I'm gonna create some input actions. One for move left, one for move right, and one for jumping. To move left, I'm gonna use the key A. Move right is gonna be D, and jump is gonna be space. Okay. So I'm gonna set my input vectors X property to input dot get action strength, move right, subtract input dot get action strength, move left. And so my input vector.x is gonna be 1 if I'm pressing move right, and it's gonna be -1 if I'm pressing move left. And it's gonna be 0 if I'm not pressing either. So now let's set our velocity using this input vector.x times delta times acceleration. Oh, I should set velocity.x, not velocity. Okay. And let's not forget to call move and slide velocity, and let's give it vector2.up. Play. And with these, just with these, we can start to move horizontally, but there's no limit to our speed, so we're getting some crazy speeds, and the player, even though I'm not pressing any keys right now, the player is still moving. So we need to implement maximum speed and some friction so that the player stops after I stop pressing left or right. I'm going to define some constants up here. First one is going to be max horizontal speed, which I'm going to set to 128, and the next one is going to be friction weight. This is going to be 0.15. So after we set our velocity, let's also clamp it so that it never exceeds the maximum. Clamp velocity.x, and it's going to be clamped in between negative horizontal speed and the positive horizontal speed. This is going to be negative horizontal speed instead of 0 because we could also be moving towards the left, and when we do, our speed is going to be negative. Our velocity, I should say. Okay, now we should be maxing out at 128. Let's print the velocity. And let's also set the velocity back to the return value of move and slide. Yep, we can't exceed 128. Cool. Now let's do something about the friction. So after we clamp our velocity, well, first let's add some comments here. I'm gonna say horizontal movement here. Let's say friction down here. And if the input vector dot x is 0, that means we're not pressing right or left. We should start interpolating our speed to 0. Because if we just set our speed to 0 instantly, that's going to be a very harsh stop. And we want our player to slide just a little bit before stopping. I'm going to say velocity dot x equals lerp, which is linear interpolate, velocity dot x. Let's interpolate down to 0 using the friction weight. And if the absolute value of velocity dot x is less than 0.1, let's just set it to 0. Because we don't want Godot to keep interpolating after we reach a very small number. Awesome. So now I'm gonna print the velocity again, and this should be working. So if I stop pressing down, my character stops, and it's not a very harsh stop. You can see on the output window that I'm slowly interpolating down to 0. Okay, now I'm gonna make it so that my player looks in the direction I'm moving. So let's say look in the right direction. If the input vector dot x is -1, let's say, well, first let's get a reference to our sprite up here. Let's say sprite dot flip horizontally true, and let's say else if the input vector dot x is 1, let's say sprite dot flip horizontal false. Great. Now let's add gravity and jumping. I'm gonna do this after I call move and slide, because is on floor and some other useful functions are set after calling move and slide. So after we call move and slide, let's apply gravity. And we just need to set the velocity.y plus equals gravity times delta. And just like that, now we have gravity. Now let's add jumping. And before we do that, let's also add a max falling speed. Because if the player is high enough, he's gonna be accelerating downwards like forever. We don't want that, we want to max out at a certain speed. Max fall speed, let's say 128. Velocity.y equals clamp, velocity.y, so let's say velocity.y, and it's gonna be max fall speed. So let's try this out by printing. And let's take the player and move him up in the world so that he falls for a bit more. And yes. Okay. Now let's do the jumping part. So if input dot is action just press jump, and we're on the floor is on floor, let's say velocity dot y equals negative jump force. Let's play. Oh, We have to fall first, and now I can jump. But if I'm not on the floor, I can't jump. Awesome. We're almost done. We're only gonna implement the animations. Lastly, I'm gonna take the player and move him down to here. And inside the player, we have an animation player. Let's create a new animation, call it idle. This is gonna be autoplay, and it's gonna loop. It's gonna be 0.4 seconds long. Let's take a look at our sprite frames, and let's key the frame 0, 1, 2, and 3. This is the idle animation. Let's create a new one called run. It's gonna be 0.4 seconds. It's gonna loop. This is gonna start from frame 4 till 5, 6, 7. This is for running. Okay, now let's add the jumping. This is also going to be 0.4 seconds long in loop. It's going to start from 8 till 9, 10, 11. And finally, the fall animation. Okay, now let's go back to our script, and under jumping, let's add our animations. Let's create a variable called animation. This is going to be idle by default. It's going to store a string, the name of the animation. And let's say if the absolute value of the input vector .x is greater than 0, that means we're running. Let's set the animation to run. And if our velocity.y is less than 0 and we're not on the floor, that means we're jumping. So let's say if velocity.y is less than 0 and we're not on the floor, that means we're jumping. And we want to do this after we check for run, because even if the input vector.x is greater than 0, if we're not on the floor, we don't want to play the run animation. We want to be playing either jump or fall. Let's copy this and let's say greater than instead of less than, and this is going to be fall. And finally, let's get a reference to the animation player. Let's say animation player.play animation. Now, by default, we're playing the idle animation, and if I start running, it switches to run, and if I jump, we're playing the jump and fall animations correctly. Great. So this is the beginning of a platformer game that you can use, that you can take it from here and create something your own. Like I said, this was a bit fast-paced and more like a demonstration instead of a tutorial. Let me know if you want a tutorial on this, a more in-depth tutorial. And if you liked this video, please leave a like, subscribe, and comment. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in another video.